Thank you so much, Wayne. We really appreciate you giving this talk and sharing with us your experiences and your knowledge and your enthusiasm about basic income and starting our talks out this inspiring way. I want to now introduce our next speaker. Carissa is going to come up and tell us a little bit about Rob Rayner. And while you do that, I'll get Rob's slides.
Good morning. Rob is the proud father of 2 grown daughters. His career has spanned outdoor recreation, conservation, social justice, and politics, with leadership positions at community, regional, and national levels. He now lives near Perth, Ontario, where he works on 2 causes: basic income and conserving biological diversity. Rob Rayner has been campaigning relentlessly for basic income since March 2013, following 6 years as executive director of the charity Canada Without Poverty. Rob provides various support services to Basic Income Canada Network and has presented on basic income in Charlottetown, Ottawa, Kingston, Peterborough, Waterloo, the Niagara region, and Victoria. In 2012, his work on poverty in Canada was honored with the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal. In January 2013, Rob was thrilled to reach the top of Mount Kilimanjaro as part of an Outward Bound Canada fundraising expedition. His talk today is the Basic Income Guarantee for All. The time has arrived.
Just going to give you a second to get set up. That wasn't meant to be the first slide, but it's actually perfect. Handheld mic. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Caledonians. Always wanted to say that word. It's great to be here. Thanks to the organizers, Mandy and her team, Pierre, and all the others for, I think, a really great day of activity. And thank you for coming from Halifax and around Nova Scotia, and friends from New Brunswick, where I lived for 18 years, and hopefully others. And Mayor Savage, who I got to know a little bit doing my work as poverty issues in Ottawa. We've got a great mayor here. We've got a number of fantastic mayors across the country, which is great for this cause and others, people with very strong social consciences. So there's a lot to cover about this topic, and you're going to learn a lot about it today. And let's get a bit of a sense of where your knowledge is on basic income. How many of you only have a very elementary level of understanding of basic income? Okay. How about more moderate understanding? You know, we've got some depth. Okay. Any experts in the room? And I'm not one of them either. So we've all got something to learn, and I think it'll be a rich exchange. So this event today is actually happening at a time of tremendous movement on this issue. Those of us who've been working on this for a number of years are kind of astonished how quickly we've gone from sort of a marginal thing on the fringe of public awareness to all of a sudden something that's very much in the news and on the lips of politicians. And that's for a whole bunch of reasons, but part of it's due to a lot of activism and hard work, but I think also due to a rising number of people in the so-called precarious. Wayne Luchuk, who I just met today, is going to be talking about precarious labor, and I think it's a phenomenon of our time that's going to be with us for a long time. So as many more can find themselves economically insecure, they're learning about basic income, and it's kind of making a lot of sense. As it did to me when I first started working in Canada with poverty in November 2006, I'd never heard of guarantees. And as soon as I learned about the concept, I just thought, oh, this makes total sense. Why aren't we doing this? And ever since, it's remained, to me, I think one of the most vital public policy measures of our time. But the pickup has been so strong that we've actually had some political announcements that have taken us by surprise. We didn't think we'd be here so soon. We thought this was 3 to 5 years down the road. Ontario government announced about a month ago that they intend to go forward with a pilot project on basic income. That really took much of us by surprise. Some of my colleagues have been meeting with the Ontario government, but we didn't think they'd come so quickly and say, you know, we're actually going to take a look at this. And Premier Wynne said just very recently that she mused publicly that we have to do something different than what we're doing with social assistance. So that's a pretty good indication that this issue has really permeated the public consciousness. In about 10 days, there's 2 back-to-back events in London, Ontario, again organized by advocates just like Andy and Kira and their team. They'll feature debate on basic income by 2 of my colleagues, Jim Mulville and Toronto Cosmo on one side, and 2 people on the other side who are skeptical about basic income. So that's going to be interesting. That's going on one night, and the next night is more in-depth discussion in London about this issue. So that's fantastic. Next month in Winnipeg is the North American Basic Income Congress, which will bring people from all over the world, that's from Canada and the United States. And the Basic Income Canada Network is centrally organizing that event. And that'll be a great opportunity for those who can get there to get a lot of depth about this particular issue. I should also, and Mike mentioned it too, mayors across the country are picking this up. Mayor Nenshi, Mayor Iveson, making very helpful public comments last year. And we had a colleague of ours who's been interviewing mayors across the country, including Mike, and some of those interviews are published on the website of Basic Income Canada Network. So we have this fantastic level of awareness and growing support. What I'm going to talk about here are 5 things. The first is to give you kind of a high-level overview of what basic income is and what it's not. Talk a little bit about the rationale for it and the evidence that we have around basic income and cash transfer programs generally. Then I'm going to speak to the 3 major concerns that come up over and over, and sort of try to put forward how we as advocates are trying to respond to those 3 major concerns. And then finally, I'll give you a bit of a sense of where the movement is, and I'm going to be encouraging you to engage. That's Carissa. It's going to help me with some slides, so we're going to go from this lovely one here to start to the very first, because she's on slide 24, we have to get slide 1.
Can you speak into your mic more or something? I don't know.
Speak more into the mic? Okay.
Good part is here.
All right.
Rest it on your chin.
Are the debates televised in London? I believe they're going to be recorded, so there'll be some video of that event. Okay, so what is basic income? Basic income is a phrase. It's also known as guaranteed income, citizens' income, livable income, but it does mean different things to different people. And you'll find different definitions of this on the web. Basic Income Earth Network has a definition. Basic Income Canada Network has a definition. This is one that I've come up with because I think it's actually a little more accurate. Basic income is a form of social security involving a regular, reliable transfer of money from the government to eligible persons without condition of their labor or any other form of social participation. There's a lot in there that we could discuss all day. What does that all mean? But that's essentially the nub of it. And really the core of this idea, there's 2 main things about basic income which are super, super important. The first is non-conditionality of labor force participation. This is an income that doesn't depend on whether or not you are working or not. It does not oblige you to work. That is, in fact, a pretty big leap for our culture, because we have grown up in a culture that believes that the way to be secure is to go and work for your living. But unfortunately, that's never really held true. There's always been inequities between labor and reward. And of course, we're seeing that in the extreme now, where some people are reaping tremendous reward for virtually no labor, and others are working incredibly hard and not getting any reward. So that's the first thing, is that no labor force participation is a key aspect of basic income. And also that this is not an income that can be withdrawn. It's really almost meant to be at the level of a right. Contrast that with the next slide. Contrast that with, of course, welfare, as Wayne has spoken about, and employment insurance, 2 prominent programs in Canada and in Nova Scotia that have multiple conditions attached to them, multiple rules apply. So they are definitely not a basic income. There's all kinds of conditionality. Now there are 2 main types of basic income, and here I'm going to disagree with Wayne on something I think quite important. The 2 main ways that basic income can be delivered. One is everyone receives it. That's called in the lexicon a demigrant. Regardless of your level of income, a payment comes to you. The problem with the demigrant, the main problem with the demigrant, is that if it's to be sizable enough to make a difference on poverty issues, i.e. above a poverty level of income, the amount of money that would need to be distributed would be gargantuan, in the hundreds of billions of dollars, which is greater than the size of our federal budget. Yes, some of it could be taxed back, but there are a lot of inefficiencies in that. And as we see from the Panama Papers, the most prominent news story of the past week, there's a lot of ways in which tax can be avoided. So it is a bit of a problem for the demigrant. In fact, there's very few places in the world that have a demigrant and none that provide a high demigrant. Alaska's had a demigrant for almost 40 years. It's a payment every December, once a year, that goes to every resident of the state, except those who are in prison. You do have to live in the state for at least a year before you collect that. But it's at a fairly low level, helpful at Christmas time, popular among the citizens, but not high enough to make a real measurable difference in, say, poverty outcomes. Next slide. The other way is what we call an income-tested guaranteed income. Now, for some people, this is not acceptable. This cannot be subject to an income test, but in fact, many forms of income security programs have an income test and they're working reasonably well, such as child benefits, old age security, and guaranteed income supplement, all involve something of an income test. And they're somewhat more efficient, in my view, in terms of getting to the end result that we're seeking, which is to ensure, or try to ensure that people don't live in poverty. This graph is a way to help sort of illustrate how an income-tested benefit works, where if you have no other income, you would qualify for the maximum available basic income. But as other income increases, the basic income phases out over time. In this example, the basic income starts at $15,000 at the maximum level, and then phases out at $60,000 of income, where you would receive zero. That's in fact how our child benefit system, and to a large extent our seniors benefits, work. The Canada Child Benefit, which is coming into play as of July, will phase out, I think, around $180,000 of household income. So most families in Canada will receive something of that child benefit, but the benefit will, at the greatest amount, will go to the lowest income families. So many of us do think this does qualify as a basic income, albeit subject to an income test. And there's lots of things we could talk about around that. The last thing I'll mention about basic income, in terms of overview, is the concept of a full basic income or a partial basic income. As I mentioned, the Alaska Demigrant is a partial basic income. Optimally, what we're trying to get to in Canada are a full basic income for those who have no other source of income. In other words, that basic income needs to be high enough that a person can meet their basic needs and participate in the community, as Wayne was mentioning. So now let's go on to why. Why would we do this? I don't think we can spend much time on this because we all know of so many reasons why basic income makes sense. But I do want to emphasize a couple of points. And like Wayne, I strongly believe that this is a human rights issue. We have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, which specifies civil rights, political rights, social rights, economic rights. And within those are the rights to food, the rights to housing, the right to an adequate standard of living sufficient for one's health and that of one's family. And for me, basic income is a means by which we make these rights real. How can you have the right to food if you don't have sufficient income to purchase it? So I think this is a really key anchor for basic income and the rationale for basic income. We have human rights agreements, we have international human rights law, but we don't honor these rights. But this is a mechanism by which we can get a lot further towards that. Next slide. Eric Fromm is a great psychologist, and I've got a paper, if anyone, I'll have my contact information in the slide, but he wrote an essay in 1966 where he talks about the psychological benefits of a guaranteed income. And again, for me, this is one of the most important things why we would do this, the psychological benefits as people have access to more income, as Wayne was talking about, having greater choice in life. So his in the essay, Fromm says guaranteed income would establish freedom as a reality rather than a slogan. We're not as free as a people until we find these mechanisms to allow people to have a greater choice. Yeah, that was cool.
Sorry, that's me.
Yeah. Whoa. And John Kenneth Galbraith, the great economist, also was a supporter of this concept, talking about nothing constrains liberty so much as an absence of income, and he believed very strongly that a rich country can't afford it. Next slide. And Martin Luther King, also towards the end of his life, was gravitating onto guaranteed income, and he also spoke about how this would aid psychological improvement, and that would increase a person's sense of autonomy and the ability to make choices and so forth. And again, for me, this is one of the most exciting things I find about basic income. Not only that it can help to alleviate poverty, but what it does psychologically to people as new opportunities in life start to open up. What will that do in terms of unleashing human creativity and all kinds of great things? So let's now move on to what is the evidence. First, I'm going to talk about evidence from a health point of view, and many of you will be familiar with this language, social determinants of health, which there's 14 or 15 in the literature that come up time and time again. Income is always at the top of that list, not necessarily because it's the most important at any one point in time, but as Wayne was saying, it's much about income. And there are many other determinants of health that have to be addressed, such as housing and so forth, but income is certainly central to this challenge of how do we promote the healthiest possible population. Gary Block is a doctor in Toronto who made news about 2 years ago when he talked about how, as a physician who works with inner city population in Toronto, he is actually in the practice of prescribing income to his patients. So he interviews them, finds out about their health problems, and then he asks them about their income. And then he points them towards income sources that they may be able to access that perhaps they didn't know about, or perhaps they need help in accessing. So that was pretty cool. And Gary's been involved with other physicians in coming up with sort of a manual for physicians to actually incorporate this into their practice. It's being taught at the University of Toronto's medical school so that physicians who are graduating can have this lens of helping low-income patients, at least, with their treatment. And Gary is a big supporter of the basic income. But we know that the correlation between low income and poor health is very, very strong, and as income rises through the gradient from the lowest quintile income to the highest quintile income, health improves pretty much on that same trajectory, on average. So for me, again, this is a compelling reason why we would do this. We want to have the healthiest population possible. Having sufficient income is pretty central to that. Next slide. Similarly, startling information coming out in the last 4 or 5 years about how poverty as a stress in the household affects the brain development of infants and our youngest children at the genetic level. I don't know how that works, but it's so profound in the household. The infant's brain and young children's brain are still developing as they move through those first apparently 2,000 days of life, that household stresses caused by poverty actually impair the development of the brains of young children. Could there be any better reason for us to move towards ensuring that people have a basic income? How many more justifications do we need? So there's lots of evidence around income and health, child health, and so forth, and I think it's pretty compelling that we move towards a very robust income security system. Next slide. But we have much more than that. Many people will be familiar with the Manitoba MinCom experiment of the 1970s, in which the federal government and the Manitoba government partnered over several years to run a trial of guaranteed income. It was shelved after a few years. It wasn't completed, but some very interesting findings were unearthed by Evelyn Forget at the University of Manitoba in terms of what this experiment, even though it only ran for a few years, what did it do in terms of population health and educational outcomes and so forth. And she's done a lot of publishing on this and speaking, and she's got a lot of access now to politicians, federal and provincial, who are seeking her input around her findings or her ideas about how to go forward with the basic income. But the evidence from this one experiment, I think, is fairly compelling in terms of there were reduced hospitalization rates that were statistically significant, increased graduation rates or participation in high school. People were teenagers were staying in high school longer, even in that short period of time. So this is some evidence that we have from within Canada. Next slide. I should also mention that Evelyn is one of our colleagues very actively engaged with this, and the executive director of that experiment in the 1970s is also very active in the movement today, as are some other employees who worked on that experiment on the research side, for example. I mentioned the link between child and brain development, child health, and income security. We actually have good academic research which has been done around Canada's child benefit system, showing that they, in fact, do make a positive difference for families and for children. Definitely could be increased in terms of monetary value, but there's good academic research has been done that child benefits, by and large, work quite well. And same for seniors. Again, I was struck with Wayne's talk and looking forward to turning 65, because a couple years ago, some researchers at the University of Calgary published a paper on the difference in health outcomes between people who are, say, 60 to 64 in age and those who've qualified for the old age security. There's a marked difference in health outcomes for those who have not yet reached that age of 65. Next slide. And lastly, on the evidence side, and much of this is up on the website of Basic Income Canada Network. There's some very good resources there, including a tabular summary of cash transfer programs around the world and in Canada and the benefits that they make. The publication of the UK in 2011, sort of a worldwide survey of the benefits and the costs of cash transfer programs in the developing world. And in some countries like Brazil, for example, they've had a long-running major program called Bolsa Familia, which reaches about 50 million people now. And there's some very good evidence to show that cash transfer programs, even if they have conditions attached to them, on balance have some very, very good outcomes for their populations. Okay, so let's now move on to the three major concerns. I'm just going to just touch upon these because time is a bit short here. The first one is, this is a recipe for dismantling the welfare state. We have to be so careful, we have to oppose, and I agree with this, we have to oppose the collapsing of much of what we have in place in Canada in terms of all kinds of social and economic supports. What I'm trying to do in this graph is illustrate, I think, where basic income can be nested within what I call a modernized social security framework. Because I think our social security framework today is very 19th century or 20th century. We need to move it into the 21st century, and in this model, basic income to me is a floor, it is a foundation. It's there to help make sure that people have their basic needs met. But in addition to that, we have many other forms of economic and social supports that are in place now and could be and should be enhanced. And we have groups and advocates that work on all of those things, but basic income is now coming in more prominently, as I think, into the mix of policies that have to be there for the kind of country we want. Basic income is not a panacea, it's not the silver bullet, and all the advocates that I'm working with across the country, nobody is talking about it as being that. So we have a lot of bridge building to do in ensuring that our colleagues who are working on other forms of really important public services and social supports, that we are working more closely together. This basic income movement really only started a few years ago, and in the early going, much of it has been doing just this kind of thing, having, beginning conversations. But as we move further forward, and particularly as governments pick up on this idea so strongly, it's got to be within a framework that includes many forms of economic and social supports. Next slide. Next big concern that we hear a lot about is that we can't afford this. The cupboard is bare. And for that, next slide. Of course, we have a phenomenon of incredible levels of inequality in our society. And this also has to be confronted. Simultaneously, as we move towards some of these very vital forms of public supports like basic income, we do have to come to terms with the inequality that's in our midst. And I mentioned the Panama Papers a short while ago. That's a prominent story that's revealing the depths to which our inequality exists around the world, the extent to which we have a very small percentage of people with enormous amounts of wealth and power as a result. Somehow that phenomenon does have to be combated, but apparently 1% of the world's population has wealth greater than the 99% of the world. Roughly the 80 richest people in the world have wealth equal to about half of the population. The 5 or 6 richest members of the Walton family apparently have wealth equal to about the bottom third of the United States. So these are vast levels of inequity that have to be addressed. So when people say we can't afford this, I think if we could actually visualize the extent to which wealth is askew, we would probably faint. So I just wanted to make that central point. Nonetheless, there is a gross cost to basic income. There's also a net cost. So the gross cost is what are we paying out to make basic income, provide the basic income to recipients, but the net cost results from the benefits that we receive back in return. And on the health side, it's going to be significant. 20% of Canada's healthcare costs are due to what's called inequity or poverty. So our healthcare system is costing us roughly $200 billion a year. So roughly 40 billion of that can be attributed to health inequities or poverty. Not all of that would necessarily be recovered through a basic income, but as population health increases, there's going to be some significant savings. So we do have to keep that in mind. The cost of poverty in Canada has been roughly estimated at 5 to 6% of our gross domestic product. So in today's dollars, that's roughly 80 to 120 or 130 billion dollars a year. So that's a very, very large cost that we're bearing already, and we have to keep that in mind. Next slide, please. Next slide. So basic income really is an investment in human capital, if you like, or social infrastructure, as Mike was saying. I think we really need to think about it that way. As we improve the prospects for people, their choices, their health, we are going to see benefits downstream as a result. And the actual cost will depend on the details of the design. And there's a lot of complexity around that. I'm speculating that the net cost will be in the tens of billions of dollars, but that's an affordable figure for us to cover. There are many ways to finance basic income, and we don't have time today to go into all of those. There'll be a few examples of possible sources of revenue. In the current tax system are some 200 tax credits that cost the federal treasury around $100 billion a year. Some of those are known to advantage the better off. Some of them are known not to have the effect that they were believed to have in relation to low-income populations. So there is some percentage of that $100 billion that could be rolled into a better income security program. Tax havens, again, getting back to the Panama Papers, colleagues of ours at the Canadians for Tax Fairness have come up with estimates of how much money is available in closing down tax loopholes and going after money that's in tax shelters and so forth. And we're talking certainly a number of billions of dollars there. And some other interesting ideas, such as perhaps we should be looking at a very small tax on technology. And I'm talking about that in a moment here in terms of technology and how it's interfacing with this issue. But say automation and robotics, perhaps a small tax on that kind of technology, which is going to become increasingly pervasive in our life, with profits going to the owners of that technology, but perhaps some of that should also be rolled into a basic income. So there are many ways this can be financed. I would just encourage us never to accept the argument that we cannot afford this. Okay. So the third concern, sloth. This is not a friend of mine. But if he was, that'd be fine. This, of course, is part of our culture. We so believe that if you're not working, this is what you're going to do. And it's a hard one, I think, for our culture to overcome. We're so conditioned to believing that the way out, the way to provide for yourself is to work. And no question, by working, you generally have a better chance of being able to afford the kind of lifestyle we want. But I think it's fundamentally untrue and unfair to point and suggest that this is how people are going to react if they have a basic income. Next slide. So along the same line, the whole myth of hard work equals reward. But as I said before, there is a growing disconnect between, in our world today. It's been a rapidly growing disconnect, and now it's an extreme disconnect, where for very, very little work, some people can get enormous reward, and for enormous work, others have essentially no reward. As has been said, if hard work equaled wealth, every woman in Africa would be a millionaire. So let's go on to the next slide. The reality is that basic income in most conceptions is only thought to be at a level high enough to meet essential sort of core basic needs, and being able to participate because of that more meaningfully in one's community. We're not talking about super high basic income, $50,000 a year or something like that. And then there are other forms of needs, as Maslow talked about. There's other forms of needs that can't be met on the basis of how much income you have. Participation is a very big part of that. Being able to participate in one's society, make a contribution of some kind, contributes to other types of needs beyond the physical or the physiological. So because of that, I think there's good reason to believe that most people, even if they have a basic income, will pursue activity and work, if you like, that has meaning for them and has a positive contribution to society. So I think that's part of our response. Next slide. There's a phrase amongst some of our basic income colleagues in Europe, freedom from work equals freedom to work. How many of us know that phenomenon of having to go to work because you've got to put food on the table, as opposed to, no, I'm going to work because this is something I really, really want to do, and I really enjoy what I'm doing. We often see in the media stories of the percentage of our population who don't like the work that they do. And I think that's very, very commonplace. I love this idea of freedom from work in order to freedom to work. And how basic income can aid and support entrepreneurial activity of all kinds, economic entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, and I think this is a phenomenon for the 21st century. With the kind of economy and the kinds of changes in the labor market, we're going to need to have a platform of income that can allow people to pursue their entrepreneurial talent or aptitude, their ideas. Next slide. And very, very importantly, basic income serves to give meaning to work that's not amenable to the paid labor market. Caregiving of all kinds, volunteer activity, creative pursuits, these tend to be undervalued in our society, but basic income would help to ascribe a value to those kinds of activities. I'm involved in music and theater in my community, and I was reflecting how the town of Perth, Ontario, which has a very vibrant art scene, it's only a town of 6,000 people, but it's got 2 theater companies, it's got a professional summer theater thing going on, as well as many other forms of arts, and how vital that activity is for the economy of Perth. When people come to Perth in the summertime, they're looking for things to do, and the theater productions that are being put on, amongst other things, are contributing to the economic life of our community. And so for those of us who participate in these activities as volunteers, in our own way, we're contributing to the economic life of our community, and a basic income would help to give some value to that kind of activity. So woven into this whole theme of work and where it's going, of course, is I would say the threat of automation, large-scale automation, robotics, and so forth. This is also increasingly in the news, and if you've seen some of the media stories or academic reports on projections of what this could mean in terms of displacement, it's pretty amazing and pretty stark and pretty scary all at once. One study out of Oxford University, next slide, predicted that 47% of all jobs in the US could be automated within 20 years. So you don't want to have as a career aspiration being a loan officer, where 98% of those jobs will disappear because of automation. And this is because the power of computing has grown so strongly in just a very short period of time, and it's increasing exponentially, leading to massive amounts of technological penetration, if you will, into the labor market and other forms of our life, but with potential for a vast displacement, not only of whole jobs, but of many tasks within jobs. I read recently that 90% of all articles that appear in the media, journalistic type articles, will be written by machines. And that capability is already there in terms of machines that can write, machines that can compose music, machines that can perform surgery, and so forth. It's pretty incredible how fast this is coming, and how are we going to prepare ourselves if, in fact, this massive displacement of labor takes place. So, in fact, many people from the tech sector are coming to basic income and saying, we think this is going to be a vital policy for in the near future here. So let me just close by talking a little bit about where we are in the movement. And it is a movement. I see every day emails that come through from people across the country who are wanting to get involved in this cause, from BC to Newfoundland to the north. And I think this is only going to continue to mushroom because we have this vast precarious workforce, and I think more people find themselves, particularly younger people in the 20s and 30s, who have uncertain job prospects, far more than my generation did. So the generation after me is facing much more uncertain labor market than I am. So we're seeing a lot of folks that are coming to this cause from that perspective. And so it's very exciting, but we have to get ourselves organized. Basic Income Canada Network is the only national organization wholly dedicated to this cause. We have a growing number of local and regional action groups across the country. You can find them on our website, which I'll put up the URL here momentarily. But we have local and regional action groups which are forming autonomously like Basic Income Nova Scotia and set their own agenda. BICN does not have a chapter structure. It does not want to have a chapter structure. What we want is to see conversations like this taking place across the country and people getting organized in their communities. This does need to percolate up from the street level and the grassroots level to our political figures. We have receptive politicians like Mike and Andy. I'm going to come to see you in Ottawa. And I think we have many receptive politicians who are looking at the immediate context and the near future and know that we have to do some things differently. So I strongly encourage you to get involved. If you're not already, get involved in this movement. Contact the folks with Basic Income Nova Scotia. Ask how you can help. There are so many things you can do. Up on our website, the ICN's website, we have sort of an overview of the multiple ways that people can contribute to this. But part of our challenge is to develop a very cohesive narrative and argument for basic income. We had some robust discussion around the dinner table last night among 7 or 8 of us about some of the details and some of the ins and outs and some of the difficulties, because this is not necessarily easy transitioning to an income security system in which there is not that so-called expectation of work. That's a big leap for our culture to make. But I think we can do it. We already have examples of programs that are basic income-like, child benefits and senior benefits. We know that they work. Generally speaking, they each could be enhanced, should be enhanced with the amount of dollars available. But that working age population is the big challenge. What we're trying to do now is keep up with all the energy and all the interest that's being shown. And with very live interest from the Ontario government and also the Quebec government, hopefully soon the Nova Scotia government. Our challenge is going to be to try to make sure that whatever governments are going to do in this direction is going to adhere to some very core principles and not backfire on what we want. So let me just close by just touching on a few things that's in a handout, which I think most of you have. BICN just put this up on the website, and it's called The Basic Income We Want. So BICN just put this up on the website last week. As an organization, when it started off working on this, it was largely kind of an academic thing, and then it became, oh, we've got to start getting ourselves organized. And basic income was being talked about at a very high theoretical level. We're now getting down to more specifics, and it's becoming increasingly necessary to really articulate a more precise vision of what we're striving for. So the document that some of you have, and there's copies over here if you don't, touches on what would a good basic income design for Canada look like. And I want to stress too, a good design means that people are not worse off as a result of basic income. They're in fact better off. So any proposal with basic income would result in some people being worse off is not something that we can support. I won't go through all of those points just in the interest of time, but maybe that's something we can get into in discussion later on today. And with that, I think I should close. Mandy's looking at me. Yes.
One of the concerns I have about basic income is, would there be a way to control hikes in rent?
That's a great question, and it really speaks to the slide I put up before about how we need to have various forms of social and economic supports in place. So the relationship between basic income and how that would impact rents. What would landlords do if they knew that all of a sudden people had more income? It's a very, very good question. I don't necessarily have the answer. I do know it needs to be looked at, and there needs to be some kind of, I strongly believe in some kind of way of controlling what landlords are able to do in terms of jacking rents or whatever. Because we can't have a society, in my view, a healthy society doesn't do that to people. There's got to be some reasonable scale here. But it's a very good question. I think the whole housing area, which is not an area I'm directly working in, I don't tend to have much knowledge of exactly what people are calling for to make sure that it's affordable housing and accessible housing. Those policies need to mesh with this somehow. And I think it is the job of politicians to make sure that there's a policy framework that doesn't allow people to kind of unjustly capitalize on the fact that now people have more income in their pockets.
Rob, on the left.
We have a gentleman over here. Is there an income cutoff for the basic income? That's another very good question. It really speaks to the details of policy design. I strongly believe that the maximum amount available has to be above any poverty threshold that we choose in the country, be it the low income measure or the low income cutoff. For an individual, I think it's probably in the range of $20,000 to $25,000 a year. It should be enough to ensure that people can cover their basic needs and participate meaningfully, at least in their community. And I think, have ways in which we can figure out what that metric is going to be. In Britain, there's been an organization there called the Roundtree Foundation, which every year publishes a minimum income standard for Britain. It's based on public consultation as to what constitutes the minimum income needed to live in Britain today. And it's really quite interesting, the kinds of things that they identify. And I just noticed in the media that the CRTC, which regulates telecommunications, is actually having a discussion now, should the internet be considered a fundamental right as part of telecommunications? I believe it should, because it's so essential for people in their connectivity. So there's a cost to that, right? So if you're paying $30 or $40 a month for internet, that should be factored in my view, into your basic needs. So there's no direct answer to your question, but I think many of us would say it's got to be at least or slightly above any meaningful poverty threshold in the country.
I think one here.
Is there any evidence for, sort of critical mass required to sales? Ontario is a pilot in Australia. Can Ontario be involved
So the question is there a